I was 23 the first time I understood that a woman in my community was not allowed to grieve out loud. It was a Wednesday in late February, the kind of day where the snow on the garden had gone gray at the edges, and the sky pressed down on the barn roof like a low ceiling. I was standing at the kitchen window with a dish towel in my hand, and I had been standing there long enough that the water on the plate I was holding had gone cold and started to bead. My daughter had been buried 6 days. Her name was Miriam. She had lived for 41 hours. And what I remember most about that Wednesday is not the casket, which was the size of a bread box, and not the small mound of dirt in the family plot behind the schoolhouse, which my husband Jonas had shoveled himself, because that is what Amish men do. What I remember is my mother-in-law walking into my kitchen without knocking, taking the dish towel out of my hand, and saying in a voice so soft it sounded almost kind, that it had been a week and the kitchen was beginning to talk. I did not understand at first. I asked her what she meant. She did not look at me. She folded the towel into a square and then into a smaller square, and she laid it on the counter the way you lay a hymnal on a wooden bench, and she said the kitchen was talking because there was no bread rising and no coffee on, and the wash had not gone out on Monday. She said the women would be coming by, and the women would see, and the women would say things, and the things they said would travel. And then she said the sentence I have carried in my apron pocket like a stone for the rest of my life. She said, "A mother who cannot get back to her work is a mother who does not trust the Lord's wisdom." That was the day I learned that in my community, grief had a shelf life, and mine had already expired. My name is Hannah. This is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where I tell the stories nobody told me when I was inside them. And I tell them the way Amish women always learn things. Quietly, sideways, in a kitchen, while the kettle ticks on the stove. I grew up Old Order Amish in Holmes County, Ohio, in a district so conservative that the bishop still measured the brim of a man's hat with 2 fingers laid flat. I was married at 19. I left at 26. And if you are watching this, if you have stayed with me past the first minute, I want you to do something for me before I keep going. I want you to subscribe, and I want you to leave the bell on, because what I am about to tell you is not a story that gets recommended by anyone's algorithm, and I want you to be able to find me. And in the comments, and I read every single one, I really do, I sit with my coffee in the morning and I read them. I want you to tell me one thing. I want you to tell me whether you have ever been told, in any way, by any voice, that your sadness was an inconvenience, that your grief was taking up too much room, that it was time to put it away and get back to the work. Tell me. I want to know where you are watching from, and I want to know if you have ever been asked to be smaller than your own sorrow. I will tell you about the Ordnung in a minute. I will tell you about the bishop, and I will tell you about Lydia, who I have not told you about yet. But first, I want you to understand something about the shape of the world I was raised inside, because none of what comes next makes sense without it. In the outside world, when a baby dies, there is a vocabulary for it. There are words like loss and grief and miscarriage and stillbirth and infant mortality and bereavement leave and grief counseling and support group, and even the cold clinical word neonatal, which at least acknowledges that something happened to a person and that the person was a person. In my community, none of those words existed. We had one phrase, and it was the same phrase used for a calf that did not make it through a cold night, and the phrase was, "The Lord took her back." That was the whole vocabulary. The Lord took her back, as if she had been on loan, as if my body had been a borrowed cradle, and the loan had been called in, and the only acceptable response was to say thank you and return to scrubbing the floor. The Ordnung, the unwritten code of our community, the one that lives in the air and on the porch, and in the look an ant gives you across a room, does not have an official rule about how long a woman is allowed to mourn. It does not have to. The Ordnung never had to write anything down. Everyone knows. No one says. The rule about grief, if you had asked anyone in my district, did not exist. And yet every woman in my church knew exactly how many days she had before the visit started, before the casseroles stopped, before the kitchen began to talk. The number was 7. After 7 days, you put the dark dress back on the hook, you tied the apron, you lit the stove, and you became useful again. Gelassenheit, yielding, applied to the dead the same way it applied to the living. You yielded your child the way you yielded everything else. Quietly, without complaint, without the sin of Hochmut, which is pride, which is the cardinal sin for women, and which can disguise itself as almost anything, including a mother who will not stop crying for a daughter who only lived 41 hours. I want to tell you about Jonas, because I do not want you to think he was a monster. He was not. Jonas was 25 when I married him, and he was a man of few words, the kind of Amish man you see in photographs the tourists are not supposed to take. Broad shoulders, dark beard coming in patchy at the chin, eyes the color of a creek in November. We met at a church singing the spring I turned 18, and we married the following November on a Thursday, with about 300 guests sitting on benches in his uncle's barn, and the meal was roast chicken and creamed celery and 7 kinds of pie, and my mother cried, and his mother did not, and that was the whole of our wedding. Our first son came the next August, our second son the August after that. Miriam was our third. She was the only girl I would ever carry, although I did not know it then. Jonas was not cruel. I want you to hear me say that. He was a man raised inside the same silence I was raised inside, and he was working with the same tools he had been given, and the tools were not very good tools because nobody had given him better ones. When Miriam died, he did not cry where I could see him. He went out to the barn at 4 in the morning the day after we buried her, and he stayed there until breakfast, and when he came in, his eyes were red, but his hands were steady, and he ate his eggs and he drank his coffee, and he did not speak. That was his grief. That was all of it. That was all he had been taught it could be. The inciting thing, the small thing, was a song. It was the Monday after my mother-in-law folded the dish towel into a square. I was at the kitchen sink, and I was washing the same plate I had been washing the Wednesday before, and through the open window I could hear my neighbor's daughter, a girl of maybe 9, walking up the lane singing one of the children's hymns. It was a hymn Miriam would have learned. It was a hymn every Amish child learns by the time they can walk. And without meaning to, without deciding to, I began to cry. Not the quiet crying I had been doing for 9 days, the other kind. The kind that comes up out of a body that has been working a long time and finally cannot work anymore. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I put my apron over my face, and I made a sound I had never made before, a sound I did not know I was capable of, and I made it for what could not have been more than 3 or 4 minutes, because 3 or 4 minutes is how long it takes a sound like that to find you. My sister-in-law, Anna, walked in through the back door in the middle of it. She did not say anything. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, and then she walked past me and put the kettle on, and she sat down at the kitchen table, and she waited until I was finished. When I was finished, she said 3 sentences, and she said them looking at the kettle, not at me. She said, "Hannah, this is the 2nd time this week the door has been left unlatched." She said, "People walk past this house." She said, "The bishop's wife was at the post office yesterday morning." That was all. She drank her coffee. She put the cup in the sink. She walked back out through the door she came in, and she pulled it closed behind her, and I heard the latch click. That was Tier 1. I knew it was Tier 1 because I had grown up watching Tier 1 happen to other women. The withdrawal of warmth is so gradual, you can almost mistake it for the seasons changing. The casseroles had already stopped on day 4. The visits had thinned on day 6. Now the door latching reminders had begun, which meant that within a week there would be a visit from my mother, and within 2 weeks there would be a visit from a woman I would not be expecting, and within a month, if the kitchen was still talking, there would be a knock on the door at an hour when knocks on doors are not casual, and the bishop's wife would be standing on my porch with a covered dish and a face arranged into kindness. My mother came on the Thursday. She brought a jar of apple butter and a length of dark fabric because she had heard, she said, that I was wearing the same dress every day, and a woman should have 2. She did not mention Miriam. She did not mention the crying. She sat at my table for 40 minutes, and she talked about her chickens and about the price of feed and about her brother in Indiana whose son was getting baptized in the fall. And then, just before she left, she did the thing my mother always did when she was delivering hard news. Her hands kept moving. She was folding the empty flour sack she had brought the apple butter in, and she folded it once, and then twice, and then a 3rd time, and on the 3rd fold she said, without looking up, "A wife who lets the cold in cannot complain when the house freezes." And then she said, "Your husband is grieving too, Hannah. Have you made him a hot supper this week?" I had not. I had not made anyone a hot supper that week, or the week before, and I had not realized until that moment that Jonas had not asked. Jonas had been eating bread and cold ham at the table for 9 days, and he had not said a word. And the not saying was its own kind of pressure, the kind I had not learned to read yet because I had been too busy reading my own. I want to tell you about Lydia now, because this is the part of the story where she enters, and she is the reason I am sitting here telling you this and not still standing at that kitchen window. Lydia Yoder was 71 years old that February, and she was the oldest woman in our district, and she had outlived 2 husbands and 4 of her 9 children, including a daughter who had died at 16 of something that in the outside world would have been called appendicitis, but in our community was called the Lord's wisdom. Lydia was the kind of old woman every Amish district has and pretends not to notice. The kind who attends every funeral and every wedding and every quilting frolic, but does not speak much, and when she does speak, the younger women lean in without meaning to. I went to her house on a Saturday. I do not remember deciding to go. I remember harnessing the buggy, and I remember the cold on my hands, and I remember the smell of her kitchen when I walked in, which was the smell of bread and wood smoke and something herbal I did not recognize. She was at her table, snapping beans into a colander, although it was the wrong season for beans, and I realized later they must have been the last of her dried ones, soaking back to life. She nodded at me. She pushed the colander toward me. She did not say hello. We snapped beans together for what I think was almost 20 minutes before either of us spoke. When she finally spoke, she did not look at me. She looked at the beans. She said, "How many days has it been, Hannah?" I said, 15. She nodded slowly. She picked up another bean. She snapped it in half, and then in half again. And she said the sentence I have been carrying ever since. The sentence that broke open the wall of my life the way water breaks open a stone if it has long enough to work on it. She said, "I lost one at the end. I lost one at the end, Hannah. And I went back to the work on the 8th day. And the grief I did not let out then did not leave me. It went into the wall. It went into the floor. It went into the bread. I have been baking that grief into bread for 53 years. Do not bake yours." That was all. She did not look up. She kept snapping beans. After a while, I started snapping beans again too, and we did not speak for the rest of the afternoon. And when I drove home in the buggy, I did not cry, but something in my chest had shifted the way furniture shifts when a house settles. And the room was a different shape than it had been when I walked in. If you have stayed with me this far, I want you to know I see you, and I want to say thank you. These stories are not easy to tell, and I know they are not easy to hear, and if you want to keep walking through them with me, just subscribe. That is all. You do not have to comment. You do not have to do anything. Just be here. There is more to say. The bishop came on a Tuesday in March. He did not come for me. He came for Jonas. That is how it is done. The bishop never comes for the woman first. The bishop comes for the husband, in the husband's barn, with the husband's tools, and he speaks to the husband about the husband's house, and the husband is expected to bring the message inside, and the message is expected to do its work without the bishop ever having to look the woman in the eye. I know what the bishop said to Jonas in the barn that Tuesday because Jonas told me at supper, although he did not call it telling me. He called it sharing. He sat at the table with his hands folded in front of his plate, and he said, "The bishop is concerned, Hannah. He is concerned that you have not been seen at the Sunday service for 3 weeks. He is concerned that the women have noticed. He is concerned that pride may have entered the house." He used the word hochmut, Hannah. He used the word twice. I want to tell you what I felt when Jonas said the word hochmut. I felt the air go out of my chest, the way air goes out of a quilt when you press it flat for storage. Because hochmut, pride, is the only sin in my community that a woman cannot apologize her way out of. You can apologize for anger. You can apologize for sharp words. You can apologize for a dress that is too bright or a cap that is tied too loose, or a buggy lamp that is burning too long into the night. But pride, in a woman, is treated like rot in a beam. You do not apologize for rot in a beam. You replace the beam. And so I did what Amish women do when the word Hochmut enters the house. I went silent. I dried my eyes at the pump in the morning before anyone could see them. I made hot suppers. I went back to the Sunday service. I sat on the women's bench with my hands folded in my lap, and I sang the slow hymns from the Ausbund, and I did not look at the bishop, and I did not look at his wife, and I did not look at my mother-in-law, and I let the kitchen stop talking, because the kitchen was tired of talking, and so was I. For 8 months, I was a beam that had been replaced. And then one morning in late October, and I want you to picture this because the picture is the whole story, I was hanging the wash on the line behind the house, and Jonas's shirts were already up, 4 of them in a row, dark blue and dark blue and dark blue and dark gray, swaying in the same direction in the wind. And I stopped. I had a clothespin in my mouth and a wet apron in my hand, and I stopped because I had just realized something I had not realized in 8 months of being a beam. I had been pregnant for 6 weeks. I had not told anyone. I had not even told Jonas. I had not told myself in words, although my body had been telling me in the way bodies tell women things, and I had been ignoring the telling the way I had been ignoring everything else. And standing there in the yard with the clothespin in my mouth and Jonas's 4 shirts swaying in the same wind, I understood, with a clarity I had not had since the morning Lydia talked to me over the beans, that I could not bake another grief into the bread of this house. I could not. I did not have it in me. Whatever Miriam had been, whatever this new one might be, I could not raise either of them in a kitchen where their sadness, or mine, would be measured against the talking of the women and the patience of the bishop. I want to be careful here, because I know how this can sound from the outside, and I do not want it to sound that way. My husband Jonas was not a monster. He was a man raised inside the same silence I was raised inside, and he loved Miriam in his own way, and he would have loved this new one too. The bishop was not a monster. He was a man performing a role that had been performed by men in warm parlors with pie on the windowsill for 300 years before he was born. My mother-in-law was not a monster. She was a woman who had folded her own grief into her own apron pocket so many decades ago that she could no longer remember it was there, and she could not bear to watch me refuse to do the same, because if I refused, what did that mean about her? The system is the thing, not the people. The framework was the mistake, not them. I will not tell you the story of how I left today, because the leaving belongs to a different video, and I want to tell it properly when I tell it. I will tell you only that there was a Mennonite woman in town who had been watching me, the way some Mennonite women watch some Amish women, the way Lydia must have once been watched by someone before her. I will tell you that I had been hiding egg money in a glass jar in the rafters of the woodshed since the week after Miriam was buried, without ever admitting to myself why. I will tell you that I left with 1 canvas bag and a quilt my grandmother had made me, and that I walked to the phone shanty at the end of the lane on a Tuesday morning in early November, and that the wind that morning was the same wind that had been blowing through Jonas's shirts on the line. That is all. The rest is a different story. The letters I wrote came back unopened. The phone calls I made into the shanty on the other side rang and rang and rang. My mother saw me one time in the parking lot of a grocery store in Millersburg, 11 months after I left, and she looked at me for what could not have been more than 2 seconds, and she looked through me the way you look through a window when there is nothing on the other side of it that you want to see, and she got into the buggy and she drove away. My father never saw me again at all. My sisters crossed the street in town the one time I went back. The click of the receiver in the phone shanty became the sound I heard at night for a long time after, the way some people hear ocean waves. That was the sound of my people closing the door. The therapist I started seeing in my second year out was a small English woman named Diane, with reading glasses she was always losing, and 3 potted plants on the windowsill of an office that smelled like chamomile tea. She was patient with me in a way that I did not know patience could look. And one afternoon, about 6 months into our work together, I told her about the dish towel, about my mother-in-law folding it into a square, and then a smaller square, and saying the kitchen was beginning to talk. And Diane listened, and she took her glasses off, and she set them on her notebook, and she said something I want you to hear, because it is the sentence that named, for me, the thing I had not had a word for. She said, "Hannah, what was done to you has a name. It is called community-enforced compliance. It is one of the most effective systems of control human beings have ever invented, because it does not need a fist or a knife or a lock. It only needs the threat of being unseen. And the people who used it on you were also being used by it. The most effective systems of control are the ones that feel exactly like love. I cried in her office for a long time that day. Not the way I had cried on my kitchen floor when the neighbor's daughter sang. A quieter way. A way that did not feel like it was being swallowed back. She told me later more things. She told me that consent is not a door you walk through once at an altar, that grief is not a debt to be repaid in casseroles, that a community that cannot hold your questions does not actually trust its own answers, that emotional withdrawal as punishment is still punishment, even when it is dressed in a black bonnet and a soft voice. She gave me slowly the vocabulary that my community had withheld. And I sat with that vocabulary the way a woman sits with stones she has been carrying in her apron pocket without realizing. And one by one, I took them out, and I set them on the table, and I looked at them. I do not hate the Amish. I want to say that clearly. I do not. I miss the way the snow looked on the garden in February. I miss the smell of my mother's bread. I miss my sisters, who I will probably never speak to again in this life. I miss the women's bench, and the slow hymns, and the way a quilting frame fills a room. The community gave me a work ethic that has carried me through every job I have ever had since. It gave me faith in something larger than myself, even if the shape of that faith has changed. It gave me Lydia Yoder, and the beans, and the sentence about the bread, and I will carry that sentence to my grave. But if you grew up in a place where your grief had a shelf life, I see you. If you were ever told that the appropriate response to losing a child was to get back to the work before the neighbors noticed, I see you. If you have ever sat on the floor of your own kitchen with your apron over your face, making a sound you did not know you were capable of, and someone walked in and reminded you to latch the door, I see you. If you grew up in a faith community where a woman's sadness was treated as a kind of pride, and pride was the only sin that could not be apologized for, I see you. If you have ever folded yourself into a smaller and a smaller square until you fit on the counter next to a dish towel, I see you. You were not weak. You were not faithless. You were not proud. You were a woman trying to survive inside a framework that was built to make sure your sorrow could never be louder than the talking of the kitchen. And you yielded the only way you knew how, and the yielding cost you something nobody around you was willing to name. The framework was the mistake, not you. It was never you. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments which part. Tell me about the dish towel, or about Lydia and the beans, or about the 4 shirts on the line in October. Tell me your story if you are ready to tell it. I read every single one. I sit with my coffee in the morning, and I read them, and I sit with the women who write them the way Lydia once sat with me, snapping beans she could not have known I would carry for the rest of my life. Subscribe to Hannah the Amish Girl. There is so much more I have not yet said. There is the story of the leaving. There is the story of the second child. There is the story of the day I went back to Holmes County, just once, 11 years later, and stood at the edge of the cemetery behind the schoolhouse and looked at a small headstone with a name on it that almost nobody in the world remembers. I will tell you all of it, slowly, the way Amish women always told things, quietly, sideways, with our hands moving while we speak. Until next time, choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life. Your grief is a whole sentence. It always was.